The heavy click of the lock echoed through the narrow hallway. I could still hear the sharp scrape of the metal bolt sliding into place, sealing me away from the rest of the house, my home. The smell of stale air mixed with a faint scent of lavender from the hallway diffuser that someone had left outside the door. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the cool brass doorknob, feeling the chill seep into my skin. Outside, voices murmured, my daughter's husband, Marcus, and my daughter Madison. I assumed speaking in low tones, too muffled for me to catch every word, but their sharp laughter cut like knives through the quiet. Bernice, you don't fit in here anymore. Marcus's voice rang clear through the cracked open door as if he was talking to an empty room. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to spend the holidays. I could hear Madison's agreement, her tone that sharp blend of sympathy and impatience. We love you, Mom, but you're just different now. Maybe it's better this way. Different. That word felt like a slap. It wasn't just a comment, it was a verdict. They wanted me out of their sight, out of their lives, shut away like some forgotten piece of furniture. The door was locked, but the real chains were invisible, wrapped tightly around my dignity. I leaned my forehead against the door. The wood was smooth, cold, unyielding. My breath came shallow, and I tasted a bitter mix of shock and disbelief on my tongue. How had it come to this? My own family locking me away, treating me like an inconvenient guest in my own home. For a moment, my mind went blank. The pounding silence was almost louder than the voices. I shut my eyes and tried to gather my scattered thoughts. The faint buzzing of the old ceiling fan was the only sound inside the little room where I'd been confined. The walls felt close, the air thick. But inside me something stirred, a quiet flame of resolve, faint but steady. What Marcus and Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this house wasn't just a place where I lived. I was the one who owned it. Every brick, every beam, every inch of carpet had my name on the deed. And that was just the beginning. They thought they were locking me away, but they had no idea who I really was. My name is Bernice Kelly, though most people call me Bernie. I'm 73 years old, with silver-streaked hair usually pulled back in a loose bun, and eyes that have seen more than their fair share of disappointments. If you saw me at the grocery store, or walking my neighbor's dog, you'd probably think I was just another retiree living quietly on Social Security and pension checks. But beneath this modest exterior is a woman who has quietly built a secret empire, one they never suspected. That moment in the hallway, standing there as the lock clicked shut, was the breaking point. My chest tightened, and I felt the sting of tears threaten to spill, but I swallowed them down. I was hurt, yes, deeply. But I was not broken. I remembered the day Marcus and Madison first came to live with me. They were struggling after Madison lost her job and Marcus's business had hit a rough patch. Without hesitation, I opened my doors and heart to them, believing family meant unconditional support. I offered them rent-free space, meals, and comfort. I believed in second chances, but over time, things shifted. Small requests for just a little more became demands. Quiet moments of respect turned to casual dismissals. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was old-fashioned, that the younger generation just saw the world differently. But that day, locked in that narrow hallway, I saw the truth. I thought about the subtle signs I had missed, the way Marcus would glance at me with thinly veiled contempt, the way Madison's smiles never quite reached her eyes, the way they spoke to me like I was invisible, or worse, a burden. Bernice, are you okay in there? I heard a tentative voice. It was Sophie, my neighbor, peeking around the corner. Her kindness was like a balm on a rough wound. I managed a small nod, though she couldn't see it. Her concerned eyes were a reminder that I was not entirely alone. I sank slowly to the floor, the cool wood pressing against my back, and let myself breathe. I thought about the life I'd led, full of quiet sacrifices and unnoticed strengths. What Marcus and Madison failed to grasp was that I was not the frail woman they treated me as. For years, I had been quietly learning, investing, and building something they never imagined. Something I kept hidden, precisely because I knew the world wasn't ready for it. In that moment of forced solitude, A fierce determination took root. They thought this was the end of my story. But it was only the beginning. Before we jump back in, I whispered softly to the empty room. As if speaking to you, the listener, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That small call to action felt like a lifeline, connecting me to the world beyond this narrow corridor. I pushed myself up, steadying my breath. I touched the old wooden door, a symbol of their control, but also a reminder of my own power. They thought they held the keys, but I had the blueprint of this house and of their lives locked away in my mind. As I stepped back from the door, I felt the familiar ache in my knees, but also a spark of clarity. They had taken a physical key, but they could never lock away my spirit or my mind. I knew that soon the tables would turn. I had plans, a quiet, unstoppable plan that had been growing in the shadows for years. No one had seen it coming. Least of all Marcus, the man who had so casually decided I no longer belonged. As I settled onto the small, worn chair by the window, I let my eyes drift to the garden outside. The early winter sun cast long shadows over the snow-dusted lawn. The roses I'd planted decades ago were bare now, but in spring they would bloom again, just like me. The door was locked. The room was small, but my mind was vast and unstoppable. The seeds of change had been sown long ago, and now they were about to bloom. If you had met me as a young girl, you might never have guessed the storm brewing inside my quiet frame. I was born Bernice Kelly, the youngest of 5 siblings, in a small, unremarkable town where everyone knew your name and your business. The kind of place where the words, "she's too smart for her own good," were whispered more as warnings than praise. From early on, I showed signs of something different. I was the child who asked too many questions at the dinner table, who read books faster than I could digest the words, and who dreamed far beyond the dusty streets where I grew up. But those dreams didn't seem to fit the mold laid out for girls in our neighborhood. Girls should know their place, my grandmother would say, knitting by the fire. Smart girls are trouble. That was the first lesson in invisibility learning. To hide the spark lest it frighten others. At school, I excelled quietly, never raising my hand too high, never drawing attention. I didn't want to be that girl, the one who stood out and made others uncomfortable. So I learned to blend in, to soften my edges. But beneath that careful exterior was a mind hungry to grow. When I was 18, I earned a scholarship to study electrical engineering. It was a bold choice for a woman in those days, especially in my town. I remember the looks, disbelief, skepticism, sometimes thinly veiled amusement, but I excelled. I loved the challenge, the logic, the way circuits and currents obeyed clear rules unlike the messy, unpredictable world outside. Yet, despite my degree and my accomplishments, life steered me down a different path. I met James, my husband, shortly after graduation. He was kind and steady, a farmer with hands hardened by years of honest work. Our marriage was simple, built on shared values and quiet love. But as the years passed, the dreams I once nurtured quietly faded into the background. James never asked about my degree or my ambitions. It was as if the woman I was before didn't quite fit into the life we built together. I became the caretaker, the heart of the home, the mother, the one who held everything together while James managed the farm. Raising our 2 children was a joy, but it came with its sacrifices. I set aside my own desires to focus on theirs, to ensure they had what they needed to succeed. I was the one who stayed up late helping with homework, who baked pies for school fairs, who took in neighbors when times were hard, but even as I gave so much, I often felt invisible in the eyes of my family. At dinner parties or family gatherings, I was the silent presence in the corner, the woman who kept the peace, but whose opinions were rarely sought. I was the nice lady with a gentle smile but little voice. I remember one particular Thanksgiving, when my daughter Madison rolled her eyes as I pulled out a faded photo album. "Mom, we've seen these pictures 100 times, she said with a sigh. The sting in her voice was sharper than any knife. It wasn't just impatience, it was dismissal. That was the moment I realized how little they truly saw me behind closed doors. Though I was anything but ordinary, Over the years, I quietly returned to the skills I had learned as a young woman. When James fell ill and the farm struggled, I took over the financials. I balanced the books, negotiated with suppliers, and managed what little investments we had. My secret was simple. While everyone believed I was just a homemaker, I was quietly educating myself again. I devoured books on finance, investment, and business. I watched tutorials late into the night, learning about stocks, real estate, and even the emerging world of cryptocurrencies. I became an apprentice of sorts, guided by nothing but sheer determination and the desire to secure my family's future. At first, my efforts were small, opening a modest savings account here, buying a few shares there. But slowly, my investments grew. I diversified, I took calculated risks, and I learned from my mistakes. This knowledge became my hidden treasure, the one thing I never shared because I knew it would only complicate the fragile family dynamics. The years passed, and my children grew. Madison went off to college, ambitious and full of life. She never once asked about my secret world of finances. I stayed in the background, the quiet foundation beneath the chaos. Sometimes I wondered if I was foolish to keep this all to myself. Was it pride, fear, or simply the habit of invisibility I had learned as a child? I'm not sure. But I knew one thing: they could never take away what I had built in silence. The unassuming old lady who drove an ancient car, who shopped at discount stores, and who never flaunted her wealth was exactly the image I wanted to keep. I was invisible, and that invisibility was my greatest asset. I recall the many times Madison mocked my thriftiness. "Mom, why do you buy those cheap brands?" "You should treat yourself," she would say, laughing as if it were a joke. I smiled and nodded, hiding the truth that I was saving for something far bigger than a shopping spree. My family's ignorance was a shield I wielded carefully. While they spent recklessly, I watched the numbers grow. It was a silent rebellion against the years of being underestimated and overlooked. But no matter how careful I was, the emotional wounds of invisibility ran deep. Being dismissed, treated like a relic of the past, was a pain I carried silently. I learned to bury the hurt beneath layers of kindness and patience. And so, I lived a double life. To the world, I was Bernice Kelly, the sweet old lady who baked cookies and knitted scarves. But inside, I was a strategist, a financial architect, quietly shaping a future that none of them saw coming. I think that's why the betrayal hurt so deeply when Marcus locked me away. Not because they took away my freedom in that moment, but because they had spent a lifetime ignoring the woman I really was. Now, as I sat in that cold little room, I thought back on the years of sacrifices, the quiet victories, and the long nights of learning. The woman they saw was a shadow. The woman I had become was a force. This was not the end of my story. It was a prologue to something far greater. The day Madison and Marcus moved back into my home, I thought I was opening the door to healing, a fresh start for all of us. They came with heavy hearts and empty pockets, carrying the weight of lost jobs, failed dreams, and a fragile hope. That family could still be a sanctuary. Madison, my daughter, looked smaller somehow, thinner and more fragile than the confident woman I remembered. Marcus, her husband, was a man of quick smiles and sharper words, struggling to hide the anxiety behind a mask of bravado. When they told me they needed a place to stay, I didn't hesitate. It felt natural to say yes. After all, what was a home, if not a refuge? I cleared the spare bedroom, dusted off the sheets, and prepared their favorite meals. I wanted them to feel welcome, to feel loved. It was the least I could do after all the years of quiet sacrifice. For a while, the house was full of laughter again. We shared meals, stories, and even a few light-hearted arguments like old times. I told myself this was temporary, a stopgap until they got back on their feet. I was proud to offer them a fresh start, but beneath the surface, the dynamics began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. At first, the changes were subtle. Marcus would ask for extra groceries, then more, as if my modest budget was endless. Madison began requesting new clothes and gadgets, claiming it was necessary for work or social events. I told myself it was just a phase, that they were stressed and needed comfort. Then came the habits. Leaving lights on when they left a room, running the heat full blast in winter, ordering takeout instead of eating what I cooked. The grocery bill soared from a reasonable $80 a week to $237. When I hesitated to approve, I was met with sighs and thinly veiled frustration. One evening, I caught Marcus sneering as he glanced at my worn hands while I set the table. "You really don't get it, do you, Bernice? This isn't your house anymore." His words were laced with venom, sharp as broken glass. I wanted to retort, to remind him that this was my house, that every nail and beam had my name on it, but I stayed silent. It wasn't worth the fight yet. Madison wasn't much better. She took to criticizing my cooking and my clothes. "Mom, you should try something new. You look like you stepped out of the 50s, she said once, flicking through a magazine with glossy images of fashion I could never afford. But what hurt most was the cold way they treated me, as if I were a burden or an inconvenient relic of a past they wanted to forget. When I suggested we discuss budgets or household plans, their eyes would glaze over, as though I was speaking a language from another century. Still, I welcomed them into my home, hoping the family bond would heal the cracks. I reminded myself of the early days, the genuine gratitude in Madison's eyes when she hugged me tightly after a long day, the rare smile from Marcus when I brewed his favorite coffee just right. Those moments were precious, but they became fewer. What I failed to notice at first were the small signs of entitlement creeping in, the way Marcus began rearranging furniture, deciding where things should go without consulting me. The times Madison brought friends over without asking, letting the noise fill the rooms late into the night. The way they spoke over me at dinner, treating me like I was invisible. One afternoon, as I quietly watered the plants on the porch, I overheard Marcus on the phone with someone. His voice was low, but the words were clear enough. "She's just an old lady. Keeps the house, sure, but she doesn't control anything. We're the ones paying the bills now." His tone was mocking, dismissive. I clenched my hands around the watering can until my knuckles turned white. The house that had been my sanctuary felt like a cage, and these words stung worse than any lock on a door. I wanted to confront them, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I swallowed my pride and carried on, hiding the storm inside. For all their faults, I still believed in them. I believed that beneath the disrespect and entitlement was a family struggling to survive. That hope made me blind to the full extent of their disregard. I remember the night they invited friends over without telling me. The music blared, laughter echoed through the walls, and I sat alone in my room feeling like a stranger in my own home. I didn't complain. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the lights flicker through the curtains, a quiet observer of a life that no longer included me. But even then, a small part of me was plotting. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. If they wanted to treat me like I was nothing, then I would show them exactly how much they had underestimated me. Years of patience and silence had given me the tools I needed. I had the knowledge, the skills, and the quiet power they never suspected. They were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. It all began after James passed away. His illness was slow, a quiet thief that crept into our lives and stole pieces of him every day. When he finally died, the farm was barely hanging on, and so was I. The insurance payout was modest, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses, let alone secure my future. I found myself standing at a crossroads, lost, lonely, and wondering what the rest of my life would look like without him. The house felt emptier, the silence heavier. The farm, once a symbol of our shared life, was now a burden I barely knew how to carry. It was in those darkest moments that I made a decision. I would not be defined by loss or by the assumptions others made about me. I would take control, no matter how small the steps. The first thing I did was dust off the books I had collected over the years, books on finance, investment, and business. They had been gathering dust on the shelf, a secret collection of knowledge that I had never shared. Now they became my lifeline. I started with the basics, learning about budgeting, stocks, and savings accounts. The terminology was confusing at first: dividends, capital gains, mutual funds. But I was determined. I read late into the night, soaking up every word. Then came online courses. I signed up for free seminars and watched countless videos on YouTube. At first, I was clumsy, making mistakes that cost me money. I bought shares in companies I didn't fully understand. I lost small amounts here and there. Each loss a painful but necessary lesson. But with each mistake, I grew more confident. I joined online communities, forums where people shared advice and strategies. The language was technical, the pace fast. But I was relentless. Soon, I was discussing investment strategies as if I'd been doing it for years. I began to see the patterns, the cycles of the market, the rise and fall of industries, the power of diversification. I invested in a small portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. I even ventured into real estate investment trusts, buying shares in properties without having to manage a building myself. It wasn't easy. The hours I spent learning were hours, taken away from sleep, from leisure, from comfort. But there was a thrill in it, a purpose I hadn't felt in decades. It was the most engaging work I had ever done, more stimulating than any job or hobby I had pursued during my married years. I also started paying closer attention to the house and property. I learned how to increase its value through small renovations and careful maintenance. I negotiated better terms with contractors and suppliers, always with the same quiet confidence I had once used to balance our farm's books. What I built was not just wealth, it was control. Control over my own life, my own future, and yet, I kept it a secret. I drove the same old car, a clunker that barely made it through winters. I shopped at discount stores and clipped coupons like a thrifty widow. To my family and neighbors, I remained the modest, unassuming Bernice. This invisibility became my greatest asset. No one questioned why I wasn't flashy or extravagant. They assumed I had nothing, just as they always had. Meanwhile, my portfolio quietly grew. Dividends were reinvested. Real estate shares appreciated. I opened new accounts under different names, spreading risk and keeping my tracks covered. Each morning, I logged into my investment dashboards, feeling a quiet satisfaction as I watched the numbers tick upward. The slow, steady growth was a reminder that I was still capable, more capable than they had ever imagined. At first, I told myself this was just a hobby, a way to keep my mind sharp. But over time, I realized it was much more. It was my secret empire, built from the ground up in the shadows of a life that had tried to keep me small. I was no longer the invisible woman. I was a force. The contrast between my hidden wealth and the assumptions my family made about me was stark. Madison laughed when I refused to buy a new smartphone, saying I was stuck in the past. Marcus sneered at my thriftiness, assuming it was ignorance. If only they knew that while they wasted money on fleeting pleasures, I was quietly building a legacy. One day, I even bought a small rental property under a trust name. It was modest, a 2-bedroom duplex in town, but it generated steady income. I managed it from afar, overseeing repairs and tenant agreements without revealing the truth. This was the part they never saw, the careful, deliberate woman behind the scenes, turning knowledge into power. At night, when the house was silent and the world outside faded away, I would sit by the window and plan the next steps. The thrill of possibility was intoxicating. I was no longer a victim of circumstance but the architect of my destiny. I began to think about the future, not just for me, but for my family. What would happen when the truth came out? Would they respect me then? Would they understand what I had done all these years? There was still pain in their disregard, but it was tempered now by pride. I had done what they thought impossible. As I locked the door each night, the sound was no longer a reminder of confinement but a promise of security. My secrets were safe, my plans unfolding. I was ready for whatever came next. At first, their behavior was subtle enough to dismiss as stress or bad timing. But soon, the reality became impossible to ignore. The house I once nurtured with love and care became a battleground. Madison and Marcus no longer acted like guests, but like rulers in a kingdom they believed was theirs. Their disrespect grew like a shadow creeping across every corner of my life. The first sign came in the form of bills. Grocery expenses skyrocketing beyond any reasonable expectation. I used to keep the weekly budget under $80, stretching every penny with coupons, sales, and careful meal planning. Suddenly, the receipts piled up. $200. Then $237 for a single week. When I gently raised the issue, Madison dismissed it with a scoff. Mom, you don't understand. We need better food for Marcus's health. It's not like you know what you're talking about. It wasn't just the money, it was the tone. The sharp edge of condescension that cut deeper than any financial strain. There were other small but painful moments. Marcus took to rearranging the furniture without asking. One evening I walked into the living room to find the old floral sofa shoved against the wall, replaced by a sleek modern set that didn't belong to me. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He shrugged. You wouldn't have liked it anyway. It was as if my preferences, my tastes, my years of work meant nothing. They started dictating daily routines too. Marcus insisted on controlling the thermostat, pushing the heat higher in winter, blasting the air conditioning in summer. Lights were left burning long after they left rooms. Water was wasted in long showers and baths. My modest utility bills ballooned, and when I asked for cooperation, their patience thinned. You're just being cheap, Bernice, Madison said one day, rolling her eyes as she tossed a pair of worn shoes into the trash. You don't get to control everything anymore. The humiliation of being talked down to like a child was relentless. I was treated like a relic, a forgotten piece of furniture, barely human. Even technology became a battlefield. I wasn't savvy with smartphones or social media, and they exploited this. Marcus would explain devices to me with the patience reserved for toddlers, his voice dripping with pity. You just don't get it anymore, Mom. It's the digital age. You need to catch up or get left behind. The words stung, but what hurt more was the feeling of invisibility, of being dismissed. Erased. One afternoon, as I was quietly tidying the kitchen, I overheard them talking in the living room. Their voices were low, but sharp. We can't keep letting her run things. She's old, out of touch, and frankly, a liability, Marcus said. Madison agreed. She's harmless, but she doesn't understand how the world works. She needs to be managed like a child. The cruel clarity of their words hit me like a physical blow. They didn't see me as their mother, their family. They saw me as a problem to be managed, a relic to be tolerated. I stood frozen, the teacup slipping from my fingers and shattering on the floor. The sound echoed my heartbreak. But beneath the hurt, something else stirred, an icy determination. If they wanted to play games with my dignity, then perhaps it was time I showed them exactly how competent I could be when properly motivated. They had made a fatal mistake, underestimating me. As days passed, their disrespect grew bolder. Madison invited friends over without asking, filling the house with noise and chaos. Marcus began ignoring my requests about household rules, treating the home as if it belonged to him. They began to take over my routines, my space, my life. Meals were dictated by their tastes, my careful meal plans disregarded. The garden I'd tended for years was trampled by careless footsteps. The photos on the walls were swapped for modern art they didn't bother to ask about. One night, after a particularly long day, I found them laughing in the living room over a plan to keep her in her place. It was a cruel joke, but I knew it was serious. Yet, through it all, I held my tongue. I didn't want to lose control. I was gathering strength, watching and waiting. This was the point where hurt turned to resolve. The quiet sorrow I had carried for years hardened into a resolve as sharp as steel. They had no idea what they had awakened. I thought back to all the years of sacrifice, all the times I had been overlooked and dismissed. The patience I had shown was not weakness, it was strategy. Their arrogance blinded them to the truth. I was far more powerful than they ever imagined, and soon they would see it for themselves. I had watched the slow unraveling for months, the growing tension, the creeping entitlement, the thinly veiled disdain. But nothing prepared me for the moment when they came to me with desperation in their eyes, asking for help. It was a rainy afternoon when Madison knocked on my bedroom door. Her usual confident tone was replaced with uncertainty, almost shame. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked softly. I nodded, motioning her inside. Marcus was behind her, looking uncharacteristically subdued. They sat on the edge of my bed, avoiding eye contact. "We're in trouble," Madison began, voice trembling. "Marcus lost his job last month, and the bills are piling up. We're behind on the mortgage, the credit cards. We don't know how much longer we can keep this up." I stayed quiet, letting her words settle in the heavy air. "I hate to ask this, Mom," she continued, "but do you have anything saved up? Anything at all that might help us get through this?" I could hear the desperation, but also the faint undercurrent of expectation, as if I were their last safety net, their ATM waiting to be tapped. But I was calm. Inside, I was already thinking, planning. They didn't know me. They had never truly known me. I measured my response carefully. "I have some savings," I said softly, "but it's not much and it's meant for emergencies." "You'll have to be clear on your plans, what steps you're taking to fix this," Marcus scoffed. "Plans? We're doing everything we can. But it's not enough." I nodded, hiding my satisfaction. This was exactly the moment I had waited for. The moment when the roles would shift. They continued to talk, their voices thick with worry and fatigue. The house that once belonged to me was now the place they came begging for help. I listened quietly, making mental notes. I asked questions about their finances, about their debts, their income, their expenses. I feigned concern but kept my guard up. After they left, I sat by the window, watching the rain drip down the glass. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside. This was their breaking point. And my opportunity. I began to sketch out a plan in my mind, slowly, carefully, like one of the investment strategies I had come to love. If they thought I was weak, they were wrong. They had pushed me too far, underestimated my strength, and assumed their control was absolute. But I was ready. The next steps would require patience and precision. I would gather evidence, consult with experts, and prepare the legal groundwork to ensure that when I revealed my true power, there would be no room for doubt or denial. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my home, and my life. And it was about making sure they understood that the woman they had locked away was not the woman they thought they knew. The plan was set. Now, all that remained was to wait for the right moment to act. After Madison and Marcus left that rainy afternoon, pleading for help like frightened children, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The storm inside was quiet now, replaced by a sharp focus. It was time to prepare not just for confrontation, but for a final, undeniable victory. I began by reaching out to the few trusted professionals I had quietly consulted over the years. These were people who knew me not as a fragile elderly woman, but as a savvy, determined individual who had built a life from the ashes of loss. The first was Linda, my attorney. A sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, Linda had helped me update my will a few years ago. I called her the next morning. "I need to see you," I told her. "There's a family matter we need to discuss. It's urgent." When we met, I laid out the situation: Madison and Marcus's growing disrespect, their financial recklessness, and now their desperation. Linda listened carefully, nodding. "You've been patient," she said. "But it sounds like it's time to set some clear boundaries." We talked for hours, discussing how to protect my assets and ensure that my wishes would be followed. Linda advised me to update my will and establish a trust that reflected my new realities, one that would reward loyalty and responsibility, and exclude those who had betrayed my trust. Next, I met with my financial advisor, Tom. He was a quiet man with a sharp eye for details, and over the years, he had helped me manage my portfolio with care and prudence. "I want to review my accounts," I told him, "and tighten control over everything. No more surprises."
Tom smiled, understanding.
More than I said. Together, we went over my investments, my rental property trusts, and the savings I had hidden away in different names. We discussed setting up new accounts with limited access, ensuring that none of the money could be touched without my explicit permission. "We'll also prepare detailed reports for when you're ready to reveal the truth," Tom said. "Evidence is key if this ever goes to court." Over the next few weeks, I became a whirlwind of activity. I compiled financial records, gathering statements, receipts, and contracts. I documented the escalating expenses Madison and Marcus had racked up, making sure to keep copies of bills they ignored or tried to pass off as mine. I hired a private investigator to discreetly gather evidence of their disrespectful behavior, instances of property damage, unauthorized visitors, and conversations where they mocked me behind my back. Each piece of information was carefully filed, organized into a dossier that would leave no room for dispute. At the same time, I drafted a new will with Linda. The changes were subtle but powerful. Madison and Marcus were left only token amounts, a few $1,000s each, while the bulk of the estate was reserved for my grandchildren and a trust fund dedicated to charitable causes important to me. I included clauses that tied inheritance to behavior, respect, honesty, and care for family would be rewarded. Betrayal and exploitation would be punished. This was not just a legal document. It was a message. As I reviewed the final draft, I felt a surge of satisfaction. For the first time in years, I was in control, but I knew I had to prepare for resistance. People like Madison and Marcus do not give up easily. They would contest the will, try to manipulate others, and do everything to maintain their lifestyle. So I set contingency plans in motion. I moved critical accounts to more secure banks, changed passwords, and set up alerts for any unusual activity. I revoked joint access to credit cards and insurance policies. I met with a property management company to handle my rental property, removing Marcus from any involvement. Each step was a careful chess move, positioning me to checkmate the opposition. Throughout it all, I maintained my public facade. I continued to drive my old car, shop modestly, and keep my daily routines unchanged. This invisibility was my shield, but beneath the surface, I was preparing for a reckoning. I was ready to show Madison and Marcus that the woman they had dismissed, locked away, and disrespected was far stronger than they ever imagined, and when the time came, there would be no turning back. The days leading up to the moment I had been patiently waiting for were filled with a calm, almost serene determination. Madison and Marcus still acted as if they had the upper hand, unaware that the ground beneath them was shifting quietly but surely. I maintained my routine with deliberate care. Mornings began with a slow cup of tea by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The garden still needed tending, and I found peace in the small rituals of pruning, watering, and planting. The house, despite the chaos brought on by their careless footsteps, remained my sanctuary. I took time for myself too. I went to the salon for a fresh haircut and a manicure. Not because I wanted to impress them, but because I was reclaiming myself. Each small act was a reminder that I mattered, not just as a mother or a grandmother, but as a woman who had endured and was ready to thrive. I bought a new dress, modest but elegant, something I hadn't done in years. It felt good to feel good. Again. Meanwhile, I was busy with my calls, touching base with Linda to confirm the final will was signed and notarized, checking in with Tom to ensure all accounts were secure, and verifying the investigator's latest report. The evidence was irrefutable. Transcripts of Madison's disrespectful remarks, photographs of the damaged garden and furniture, and detailed financial records showing the reckless spending. The pieces were falling into place. Meanwhile, Madison had invited me to Thanksgiving dinner, her voice light and seemingly warm. I accepted, knowing it was the perfect stage for the revelation. As the day approached, I prepared carefully. I packed copies of the new will and the compiled evidence, neatly organized in a leather folder. That morning, I woke early and prepared a small tray of leftovers, homemade cranberry sauce, stuffing, and mashed potatoes, my grandmother's recipe. I intended it as a symbolic gesture, a reminder of the home I had built, and the care I had poured into it. I placed the tray carefully in the fridge and dressed in my new outfit. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back strong. Poised and ready. At the house, Madison greeted me with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus hovered nearby, arms crossed, trying to look casual but failing. The room was filled with other family members, unaware of the storm about to unfold. The dinner began with polite conversation, laughter, and the usual distractions.
But I
was calm, patient, waiting for the right moment. When dessert was served, I stood and cleared my throat. Before we eat, I said softly but firmly, there's something important I need to share. The room quieted instantly. All eyes turned to me. I opened the leather folder and laid it on the table. For years I've been dismissed, underestimated, and overlooked, I began. I have been treated as if I am invisible, as if I have nothing to offer. I paused, meeting Madison's eyes. What none of you knew was that I have quietly built a life of independence and competence. I am the owner of this house, the investments that support it, and the future that lies ahead. I handed out copies of the will and evidence. The room buzzed with disbelief. Marcus's face went pale as he read the documents.
His hands trembled, betraying his shock. Madison's lips pressed tight. "This can't be," she whispered. "It is," I said calmly.
And because of your behavior, your disrespect, your exploitation, you will no longer control my life or my legacy. I detailed the consequences' new financial demands, altered inheritance terms, and changes to their living arrangements. When I finished, I gathered my things and turned to leave. This home, I said, is mine, and I will decide who belongs. Here, I walked out, leaving silence and stunned faces behind. Outside, I breathed deeply. The trap was set, the plan executed, the next chapter had begun. The room was thick with tension, an invisible weight pressing down on every soul present. The air had gone cold, as if the warmth of family had been replaced by the chill of revelation. This was the moment I had both dreaded and awaited. The day the truth would shatter the carefully constructed facade. Madison and Marcus had lived behind. It all began with the usual din of voices, laughs, small talk, the clinking of silverware at the holiday dinner. I sat quietly, observing, feeling the familiar sting of invisibility. Then, when the dessert plates were cleared away and the last fork scraped the plate, I rose. "Before we continue," I said, voice steady but firm, "there's something important I need to share." Heads turned sharply, the noise ceasing immediately. Eyes wide, brows furrowed, a few breaths held. I took a deep breath and began. "For years I've been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by the very people I love most. You treated me as if I were invisible, as if I had nothing to contribute or control. But that was never true." I reached into my folder and pulled out the documents, wills, deeds, bank statements, investment summaries, all meticulously organized, tangible proof of what I had quietly built. "This house," I said, holding up the deed, "is mine. Not because I was given it, but because I earned it. Not because you helped me, but because I persevered alone." Madison's eyes narrowed, disbelief flashing in them. Marcus paled, his hand shaking. As he reached for the papers I handed him. "You don't understand," Marcus stammered. "We thought you were struggling. We wanted to help." "Help?" I echoed, voice sharp. "Or take control? You dismissed my opinions, ignored my rules, and treated my home like a hotel. You spent recklessly and mocked me behind my back." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of rustling papers and uneven breathing. I continued, detailing specific moments, the inflated grocery bills, the rearranged furniture, the private conversations where they plotted to manage me like a child. "You've spent years looking down on me for being poor while you've been drowning in debt," I said. "You thought you could live off my generosity forever." Madison's lips quivered, her face flushing. "We didn't mean it like that." But words now felt hollow. I laid out the consequences clearly, the new will, leaving them only a token inheritance, establishing trusts for the grandchildren, and the financial controls that would cut off their access. "You will respect my home and my decisions," I said quietly, but with iron resolve. Marcus's face whitened further. "You can't do this. We'll contest everything." I smiled, a calm but unyielding smile. "I have already prepared for that." There were tears then, bitter, raw, unrestrained, from Madison and Marcus. But I stood firm, unshaken. When the confrontation ended, I gathered my things.
"This
house is mine," I said, "and I decide who belongs here." I walked out, leaving a room filled with stunned silence and shattered assumptions. Outside, the cool air felt like freedom. I had reclaimed my dignity, my home, and my life. They would have to reckon with that truth, and with me. The house was silent for days after the confrontation. Not the comforting kind of silence, like when a storm passes and all that's left is the soft hum of rain on the windows. This was different, charged, uncertain. Madison and Marcus moved through the rooms like ghosts, their presence shrunken, their voices hushed. I heard the murmured arguments through the walls. Not that they were careful, I think for once they didn't care if I heard. Marcus paced the hallway outside my door that first morning, phone pressed to his ear. "We need to talk to someone," he whispered urgently. "There's got to be a way to contest it. She's not well, she's clearly confused, she's been hiding money." I closed my eyes and let the words pass through me like a breeze. Let him panic. Let him realize how much he never knew. Madison, on the other hand, retreated inward. She barely looked at me when we crossed paths. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red, but her pride so polished and sharp for so long was now dull, cracked. I could feel them scrambling to make sense of it all. They couldn't reconcile the person they built in their minds me, the quiet, outdated, dependent old woman with the truth now sitting before them. I had never needed them. They had needed me. Their initial attempts at control had turned into silence, then small acts of defiance. The following afternoon, Madison removed the framed photo of our family from the mantel. No words, just quietly took it down and walked away. A symbol, I suppose, of what? Denial? Anger? Meanwhile, my phone rang nonstop. First came the messages from extended family. "Aunt Lucy, is it true? I heard you've been supporting Madison's family this whole time. Is it true you own the house?" I answered no. One at first. Let them sit with the rumors. Let the story ferment and spread on its own. But then came Sarah, my eldest granddaughter. She called late in the evening. Her voice was soft, uncertain, but genuine. "Grandma, is everything okay?" I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone close. "Things are changing, honey. But yes, I'm okay now." There was a pause. Then, "I didn't know how bad it was. I'm sorry." That apology cracked something open in me. A small place that had been locked tight. "It's not your fault," I said. "You're not responsible for the choices your parents made." She hesitated again. "If I come visit, would that be all right?" I smiled. That would be more than all right. And so the family began to fracture in unexpected ways. Michael, my son, who lived 3 states away, called next. "Mom, I had no idea. Madison told us you were struggling, that you were getting forgetful, that she had to manage things." I let the silence stretch. "Do I seem forgetful to you, Michael?" He let out a long breath. "No, you never did. I didn't question it. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Not that Madison lied, but that he hadn't asked. That he had been so willing to accept her version of me. I'm sorry," he added, voice thick. "I should have checked in more. I should have visited." "You still can," I said. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I took myself out for coffee. I wore my favorite scarf and a fresh coat of lipstick. I sat in the cafe with a book I'd been meaning to finish and sipped slowly. No one rushed me. No one questioned me. Later that week, I took a short walk through the neighborhood. A few people recognized me. Mrs. Ramirez from 3 doors down waved and said, "Good for you, Lucy, about time." Word had clearly traveled. Madison tried to approach me the next morning. She knocked once, stepped into the living room, and stood there like a stranger. "I know we messed up," she said quietly. "But can't we talk? Can't we figure out a way to move forward?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted to believe her. But it wasn't time yet. "I'm not ready," I said plainly. Her face twisted, as if she wasn't used to hearing no. "Not from me. You're punishing." No," I replied. "I'm protecting myself." And with that, I left her standing there. Later that day, I began browsing real estate listings. A condo near the waterfront. A small house in a quiet retirement community. Not because I was leaving yet, but because the idea of choosing where I lived again felt liberating. I didn't need to stay in a house full of echoes. The next morning, I made a call to a moving company. Just an inquiry, nothing final, but it was enough to give me something Madison and Marcus had tried to strip from me for years' freedom of choice. They could no longer tell my story. I was writing it now, 1 page at a time. The silence in the house no longer felt like an absence. It had become a presence of its own, a companion even. In the weeks following the confrontation, the air had shifted. Not just around Madison and Marcus, but within me. A door inside had opened slowly, and behind it was someone I'd forgotten. Someone I had been, or maybe had always wanted to be. I began with little things. I dusted off my sewing machine from the closet. The whir of the motor, the hum beneath my fingers, it all came back like muscle memory. I started making table runners and pillow covers, not because anyone asked, but because I enjoyed it. The fabric was bright, floral, playful. It made me smile. One morning, I made a list, things I always said someday to. I wrote it with a shaky hand, not from weakness, but from the weight of possibility. The list included: take a watercolor class, visit the coast alone, learn how to bake croissants from scratch, get a proper massage, wear red lipstick, unapologetically buy. The following week, 2 items were already crossed off. The art class was just 6 blocks away, held in a modest studio above the bookstore. It smelled of old paper, lavender, and linseed oil. On my first day, I wore a long cardigan and sat by the window. The teacher, a kind man named Elliot, never asked my age. He only asked, "What made you want to paint?" I answered honestly, because I'd forgotten how to see myself in color. He nodded like he understood. It turned out I had a talent for it, particularly landscapes. Soft strokes, subtle shading. I painted trees reaching into misty skies, waves rising over quiet sand, a single crow sitting on a telephone wire. Each canvas felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I started walking every morning, earlier than I ever had. The streets were empty, the air clean. I'd pass the flower shop on the corner as the owner was just rolling up the metal shutters. He began to wave, sometimes offering a loose bloom for the lady with the thoughtful eyes. I accepted every time. It wasn't long before I met Margaret. She lived in the neighborhood, ran a local reading circle, and recognized me one day at the cafe. "You're Lucy Morrison, right? The one who stood up to her own family? You're a bit of a legend around here." I laughed, taken aback. "I didn't know I'd become a headline," she smiled. "Sometimes courage has a louder echo than you think." We talked for an hour. And then another hour the next week. She introduced me to her circle of friends' widows, retired nurses, former professors, strong, bright women with gentle eyes and quick laughs. They welcomed me as one of their own. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to perform. I could be thoughtful without being ignored, kind without being walked over. Margaret and I began taking day trips together. One weekend, we went to the coast. I stood at the edge of the ocean, wrapped in a scarf I had knit myself, eyes wide at the vastness. "I hadn't been there in 20 years. It's not too late for anything," she said quietly beside me. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, I wrote in my journal, "Healing is not about forgetting who hurt you. It's about remembering who you were before they did." I started cooking again. Not just for survival, but for pleasure. I hosted small lunches. Margaret, Elliot from the studio, and a neighbor named June who played cello. We laughed over roasted chicken and warm apple cake. They left their shoes by the door and their worries at the table. I began dressing for myself. I wore earrings that dangled too low, scarves that clashed with my coat, and, yes, red lipstick that glowed like a banner across my face. There was no one left to scold me for being too much. Then came Sarah again. She visited on a Saturday afternoon, holding a bouquet she'd arranged herself. "I'm learning floral design," she said. "Started a class at the community college." I let her in and poured tea. We sat in the sunroom. Her voice had changed, less guarded, more grounded. "I read your will," she said. "I saw what you did, the trust, the conditions, the message." I nodded. "It wasn't just about money." "I know," she said. "It was about seeing who we all really are." She stayed for hours. We talked about books, politics, and forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything. That meant everything. Later that month, Michael called again. He was visiting town and asked to meet. I agreed. We sat at a park bench under an oak tree shedding its leaves. He looked older than I remembered, lines of regret carving into his face. "I let them twist your story," he said. "I let distance become silence." You let comfort become blindness, I replied. But you're here now. He nodded. I want to earn your trust again, then start by listening. And he did. Little by little, my family began to return, not all of them, not in the same way, but with new eyes, we rebuilt, slowly. Not as mother and child, or grandmother and granddaughter, but as adults choosing to respect each other. But the greatest shift wasn't around me, it was within. For years I had given and given, always trying to be good, quiet, small. I had mistaken invisibility for virtue. But healing meant stepping out of that shadow. I joined a women's financial empowerment group, sharing my story anonymously at first. But eventually I used my name. I wanted others to know that it was never too late to reclaim what you thought had been lost. I donated part of my portfolio to scholarships for single mothers going back to school. I mentored 2 young women in investing. One of them told me, "You're like a blueprint of what's possible." And I suppose I am. One evening, after another watercolor class, I walked home under a purple sky. The moon was low, a quiet witness to everything I had been and everything I had become. As I reached the front steps of my home, I paused. I no longer feared what others thought of me. I no longer hesitated to say no. I no longer believed that aging meant fading. I had come into myself in the final act, not as a revenge tale, but as a resurrection. Love, I had learned, must include the self. Otherwise, it isn't love at all. The house had grown quiet again, but this time not because I felt stifled. It was a stillness filled with clarity. The tension that once weighed heavy in the walls had begun to unravel, thread by thread, pulled loose by truth. And while I moved forward into lightness and self-renewal, Madison and Marcus, still under my roof, remained trapped in the mess they had created. Their struggle had begun to show in little things. The Amazon boxes stopped arriving. The luxury shampoo disappeared from the guest bathroom. Marcus stopped drinking his favorite imported coffee and switched to generic instant. One day, I passed their room and saw Madison staring at her laptop with a glazed look. Her voice, once full of control, now trembled. "I don't know how we're going to pay that card off," she whispered. They had relied so heavily on the comforts of my quiet giving that when that faucet turned off, they realized just how little they'd built for themselves. A week later, I overheard Marcus on the phone. "No, I'm telling you, the house isn't in my name. She owns it outright." "Yes, completely. No, I don't think she changed her mind." It was clear they had begun grasping for options. Credit consolidation agencies, budget apps, friends who might lend them money. None of it worked. Madison, ever the image-obsessed host, had stopped inviting her book club over entirely. I think she feared the shame of having to explain why the furniture hadn't been replaced, or why she wasn't talking about her next vacation. Meanwhile, the rest of the family was waking up. Michael's son, David, my oldest grandson, called unexpectedly one afternoon. His voice was direct but kind. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he began. "For what?" I asked. "For never asking about your side of things. For assuming you needed help when really, you were the one doing the helping." There was a long pause. I looked over the documents Dad showed me. "The trust you set up, what you've built, it's incredible." I waited, unsure of what to say. Then he added, "I'm proud of you." That one line broke something open in me. David had always been quiet, respectful, but distant, perhaps cautious not to offend his parents. For him to say those words out loud, to acknowledge me not as a fragile matriarch, but as someone worthy of pride, meant more than he could know. Later that evening, I received an email from Sarah. The subject line read, "If you're open to it." In the message, she wrote, "Grandma, I've been thinking a lot lately about how we viewed you, about what we chose not to see. And I just want you to know I want to know more about you. The real you. Maybe you could tell me how you got started. Investing? Or share one of your stories from before I was born. If you're open to it, I'd love to learn." I wrote back that same night. "Dear Sarah, I would love that. Let's meet soon. There's more to my story than numbers, and I want you to know it all. In the meantime." I began seeing more of Madison and Marcus's unraveling. I caught Marcus standing in front of the refrigerator one morning, staring blankly at the nearly Empty shelves. He sighed deeply before muttering, "Guess I'll have to go to the discount store." I didn't say anything. That same afternoon, Madison left a note on the kitchen table. "Lucy, we're struggling. I won't pretend we're not. If you're willing to talk, even just to give us some advice. Please let me know. It wasn't the apology I needed. It wasn't accountability. But it was a crack in the wall she had built. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty. But because I was waiting for more than desperation, I was waiting for understanding. For honesty, and it hadn't arrived yet. Meanwhile, Sarah came over for tea the following Saturday. She brought her notebook and a stack of questions. We talked for hours. I showed her some of my old spreadsheets, investment notes scribbled in, margins, journals filled with observations and lessons. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You could have taught a whole course." I chuckled. I didn't think anyone wanted to learn from me. Her face softened. That was our mistake. Later, she admitted something else. After the confrontation, "I started watching you more closely, not in a judgmental way, just trying to understand. And I realized you live with so much peace. That's what I want." I nodded. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you build by honoring yourself, by refusing to shrink. Michael visited again, this time with his wife. We sat out on the porch. The three of us laughed over memories, shared stories, and eventually talked about what had happened. "I don't know how to make it up to you."
He said, "You don't need to make it up," I replied. "You just need to see me now."
And
He did, but Madison and Marcus still lived in denial.
they moved through the house like tenants whose lease was ending. They made themselves small, trying not to draw attention. Their pride had not yet given way to humility. They had suffered the consequence, but not yet reached the insight. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of waiting for remorse that may never come. Tired of pretending that proximity meant connection. One day, I passed Madison in the hallway. She looked thinner, quieter, her eyes cast down. I stopped. "You know," I said, "if you ever want to talk not out of need, but out of truth, I'll listen." She looked up, startled, then nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." And she kept walking. I didn't chase her that night. As I watered the plants in my room, I whispered aloud, "Some people will wake up. Some won't, but that's no longer my burden to carry." And for the first time in years, I slept without dreams. It began with a knock at the door, firm but uncertain. When I opened it, I found Sarah standing there, her eyes clear and determined. In her hand, she held a small photo album, the corners frayed with time. "I found this in one of Dad's boxes," she said. "It has pictures of you when you were young. I thought maybe we could look at them together." I stepped aside, gesturing her in. We sat at the kitchen table where, not long ago, tension used to thicken the air like humidity. Now it was simply quiet. Sarah opened the album, and I caught sight of a photo I hadn't seen in decades, me, holding a hammer, halfway through building the bookshelf in Michael's childhood room. "I always thought Dad made this," she said softly. "He helped. But I did most of it while he was at work." Her lips curved into a slow smile. "You were always building things. I just didn't realize how much." We talked for hours, not just about the pictures, but about the years lost in assumptions and filtered retellings. She asked questions. Real ones. The kind that came from a desire to know, not to challenge. "What made you start investing?" she asked. "Loneliness," I replied honestly. "And the need to prove to myself that I could create something entirely mine." She nodded, taking it in. "I think that's brave." When she left, she hugged me tight. Not as someone offering pity or seeking forgiveness, but as a woman acknowledging another. Equals, in a way we had never been before. A few days later, Michael called. "Sarah told me about the album," he said. "And I've been doing a lot of thinking." His voice cracked slightly. "I let you down, Mom. For years I accepted the version of you that was easiest. The version others gave me. I see now how unfair that was."
He paused. "I want to change that, if you'll let me."
I agreed to meet him and David for lunch the following Sunday. We chose a quiet spot by the lake, a place we used to picnic when the kids were small. As we ate, David asked me to teach him about long-term portfolios. You're serious? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled, dead serious. I don't want to be someone who inherits blindly. I want to build with intention, like you did. That conversation sparked something new between us, a kind of mentorship built on respect. I began guiding both David and Sarah, not as a requirement but as a choice. They listened, they learned, and slowly they began to see me in full, a week. Later, Sarah arrived with a stack of folders. I'm starting a financial literacy club, she announced. Focused on women in our community, especially older women who feel behind. I blinked back tears. You're doing what I never thought. No, she corrected gently. I'm doing what you showed me is possible. Meanwhile, Madison lingered on the edge of everything. She passed me in the hallway daily. Sometimes she mumbled a greeting. Other times she avoided my gaze altogether. It was as if she were still waiting for the opportunity to pretend none of it had happened. But pretending was no longer welcome in my life. Then, one rainy afternoon, I found her in the sunroom. She was seated in my old chair, a cup of tea trembling slightly in her hand. I read the trust paperwork, she said without looking at me. Saw what you left, what you didn't. I sat across from her in silence. I always thought I was protecting you, she continued, that you needed managing. And maybe I needed to feel needed. And what do you feel now? I asked. She looked at me, really looked for the first time in what felt like years. Lost, she said.
And ashamed.
I studied her, the daughter I'd raised, the woman who had grown up in my home, who had become both caregiver and captor. Her voice was small now, not in volume, but in certainty. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. But I do. Want to change? There was no apology in her words, not yet. But there was honesty. And that was new. Changing means facing what you've done, I said quietly. And it means letting go of control. She nodded slowly. I know. That night, I lay awake thinking about the decades I'd spent in the shadows of other people's narratives. Of how long I'd swallowed disrespect in the name of peace. But peace bought with silence isn't peace at all. It's just permission for others to keep writing your story. The next morning I made breakfast. Not for anyone else, just for me. But I made enough for two, just in case. Madison joined me at the table. She didn't speak. She just ate. It was the first time in years she'd accepted something from me without trying to manage or correct it. In the weeks that followed, she began asking tentative questions. Would you show me how you organized your accounts? Do you think I could take a class like Sarah did? I answered simply, yes. Not because she had earned back my trust, but because she had started asking the right questions. Meanwhile, Marcus was less receptive. He apologized once, vaguely, then returned to his pattern's quiet resentment, passive resistance. He never asked about the trust, never asked about my business, never offered to learn. So I let him be. Not everyone is ready for redemption. And some never will be. One Saturday, I hosted a small gathering. Margaret came, as did Sarah and David. Michael brought a dish his wife had made. And even Madison appeared, a little stiff but present. We laughed over old stories, talked about current events, and shared ideas. At one point, David asked if I would consider speaking at a local seminar on late-in-life entrepreneurship. You've got something people need to hear, he said. And not just women, everyone. I smiled. Let me think about it. Later. That evening, after everyone had gone, Madison stayed behind. She helped clean up without being asked, and then lingered near the door. I didn't think we'd get here, she admitted. I didn't think I deserved it. You don't, I said gently. Not yet. But reconciliation isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to grow, she nodded, tears brimming. Then I'll keep choosing. That was the beginning of something tentative but real. We started walking together in the mornings, not every day, not always in step. But the silence between us shifted. It no longer carried the weight of things unsaid, but the space to say new things. Eventually, I invited her to one of Sarah's workshops. She sat in the back, quiet but attentive. Afterwards, she said, I didn't know how much I didn't know. That's where everyone starts, I replied. We'll never go back to the way things were. I wouldn't want to. The new relationship forming between us isn't based on duty or guilt. It's based on mutual recognition. Of limits, of dignity, of who we both really are. There are still boundaries, clear ones. No more control. No more managing. No more pretending. If she crosses those lines again, I'll walk away without hesitation. But for now, she walks beside me, and that's enough. It started with a letter in a plain cream envelope, the kind you'd mistake for junk if you weren't paying attention. There was no return address, only my name printed in careful, almost reverent cursive. Inside, a handwritten note.
Dear Miss
Morrison, I read about your story through one of the attendees of a local women's financial literacy workshop. Your name came up again and again, not as a celebrity, but as someone quietly powerful. We host an annual summit for women over 60 who've defied odds, built something lasting, and inspired others along the way. We would be honored if you would consider speaking. I stared at it for a long time. There was a time when the idea of standing in front of an audience terrified me. But not anymore, because now my voice had weight.
It had survived. I accepted the
invitation. The event was held in a modest civic hall just outside the city. Nothing glitzy. Just earnest women with steel in their spines and grit in their stories. When I stepped onto the stage, I wore my favorite navy dress, the one Sarah said made me look 10 years younger and twice as powerful. I cleared my throat. Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Morrison, and for most of my life, I was invisible even. In my own home. The audience leaned forward. I spoke about my marriage, my children, the slow erasure of my talents under layers of expectation and assumed fragility. I told them about watching my family choose to see me as weak because it was convenient. And then I told them about the day I decided to take it all back, not out of spite, not for revenge, but because the world needed to see what a woman could do when she stopped asking for permission. After the speech, a line formed. Women thanked me, hugged me, shared their own buried dreams. A few even cried. One woman, maybe in her late 70s, clutched my hand tightly. You reminded me that it's not too late to start something, she said, even now. That evening, I was interviewed for a local radio program, then a podcast, then a regional magazine. The story of a quiet grandmother who built a hidden financial empire began to ripple outwards, carried not by scandal but by something far more powerful. Inspiration. David called a week later. You're going viral, he said, half laughing. Did you know there's a Reddit thread about your speech? I didn't know what a Reddit thread was, but I could hear the pride in his voice. I just told the truth, I replied. Exactly, he said. That's why it's spreading. Sarah, meanwhile, had launched her women's financial literacy club in full. She called it the Morrison Circle, after me. I tried to protest, but she held firm. You gave me the map, she said. The name is just the signpost. The circle grew fast. What began as a dozen women in a church basement turned into a local network of mentorship and education. They covered everything: budgeting, investing, real estate basics. Sarah even invited me to co-teach a workshop on estate planning. I watched women lean in as I shared the difference between a will and a living trust. How to choose executors, how to protect your intentions when people think you're too old to have any. Left. Afterward, one woman said, you should write a book. The idea stuck. Not for the sake of fame, but to document what I had learned, the lessons, the mistakes. The victories quiet and loud. I began outlining chapters. Chapter 1, The Power of Underestimation. Chapter 2, Building in the Dark. Chapter 3, The Cost of Silence. Chapter 4, Wealth is a Language. Learn it. It wasn't a memoir. It was a guide. A beacon. Around that same time, I started receiving invitations to speak at universities, women's groups, even financial seminars typically dominated by men. The first time I stood in a conference room full of suit-clad analysts and portfolio managers, I smiled wide. They didn't expect me to know what a dividend reinvestment strategy was. But I did. I walked them through my portfolio, how I'd shifted from mutual funds to ETFs, why I balanced high-risk and low-risk assets, the way I used trust structures to bypass probate and maintain control. When I finished, a man in the front row raised his hand and said, you should teach a course. I laughed. I already do. At home, things shifted too. Madison joined the Morrison Circle. quietly at first. She rarely spoke, but she showed up. And in time, she started contributing not just questions but insights. She was no financial genius, but she had organizational talent and a way of helping others feel heard. Eventually, Sarah asked her to help coordinate a new mentorship program for women over 50. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," Madison said. Sarah shrugged. "You weren't, but maybe you're becoming her." Their relationship, once strained by competition and misunderstanding, had started to thaw. I watched them laugh over spreadsheets, share notes, and disagree without bitterness. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Michael invited me to dinner at his home one Sunday. He cooked from scratch. The meal was slightly oversalted, but the effort was evident. "Dad talks about you all the time now," David said, helping with the dishes. "He even quoted one of your podcast episodes at work." I raised a brow. "He listens?" "Religiously." David grinned. That night, before I left, Michael hugged me. "I see you now," he said. "I really do." Those 5 words undid decades of invisibility. I didn't need statues or stages. This being truly seen by the people who once overlooked me was the deepest recognition of all. Still, the external legacy grew, one of the local universities established an annual lecture in my name, the Morrison Lecture on Financial Literacy and Dignity. The word dignity mattered to me. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about being seen as whole. The mayor's office invited me to join a task force on senior economic empowerment. I declined at first. Then I reconsidered. I showed up to the first meeting with a notepad, a fountain pen, and a deep conviction that I belonged in every room I walked into. At the end of that meeting, a younger woman on the panel turned to me. "You're kind of a legend, you know." I smiled, only to those who thought I was sleeping while they spoke. She laughed and took my hand. "I'm glad you weren't." Sometimes I walked into coffee shops and caught women huddled over worksheets I'd designed. One time, a woman in her 40s asked to take a selfie with me. "My mom listens to all your talks," she said. She used to think it was too late. Now she's investing. The ripples kept going, but perhaps the most meaningful was a letter I received from a teenager named Sophie. She was the daughter of one of the women in Sarah's circle. "Dear Miss Morrison, my mom said you changed her life. She talks to me about money now, about choices. She even gave me my first savings app. I think you helped her believe in herself again, and now she believes in me too. I just wanted to say thank you." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer, the same one that used to hold my bills and stress and unspoken fears. My legacy wasn't just what I'd built. It was what I'd inspired others to build, and that would outlast any trust, any property deed, any bank balance. It would live on in Sarah's workshops, in David's smart investments, in Sophie's savings account, in every woman who ever doubted her worth and then chose to reclaim it. Sometimes I sit alone in my garden in the early morning, just as the light begins to touch the edges of the hedges I planted decades ago. It's quiet then, save for the birdsong and the distant hum of a waking town. That's when I feel the full weight and grace of everything that's past. I used to sit in this same garden with thoughts full of what I couldn't say, what I couldn't change. Back then, I believed silence was safety, that humility was virtue, and that invisibility was protection. I didn't know yet that shrinking myself to fit someone else's vision of me wasn't humility. It was erasure. Now, I sit here whole, seen, heard, understood. When I look back on my life, I don't see it as a path lined only with betrayal and conflict, though those chapters certainly left their marks. I see a story about the slow, steady reclaiming of identity, about waking up after a lifetime of being told to go back to sleep. It took me over 60 years to say aloud, "I am enough, just as I am." For a long time, I equated love with tolerance. I tolerated slights. I tolerated being overlooked. I tolerated the rewriting of my story by people who didn't understand it. That tolerance cost me years. It cost me connection. It nearly cost me myself. But here's the thing about truth. It waits, patiently, silently, and then one day, it stands up. It doesn't need to shout. It just has to be seen. When I first revealed the truth of my wealth, my competence, my decisions, I feared what would follow, but what followed wasn't chaos. It was clarity. And from clarity came peace. Now, I understand that my journey wasn't only about proving others wrong, it was about proving myself right. I had always known deep down that I was more than they let me be. I just needed to give myself permission to live that truth out loud. I found joy in surprising the world. Yes, but even greater joy in finally matching my outside life to my inner reality. And the greatest joy of all? Watching others awaken just as I had, Sarah's workshops, David's financial counseling startup, Madison's quiet mentorship at the Morrison Circle. All of these came from seeds planted in that quiet period of my life when I studied silently, invested privately, and hoped quietly for more. What began as survival turned into empowerment. What began as secrecy turned into leadership. And what began as sadness turned into strength. I've learned that legacy isn't something you leave behind. It's something you build while you're still here. It's every act of honesty, every choice to stand tall, every time you speak up when it would be easier to stay silent. And I've learned that legacy isn't always linear. It's not about passing something down perfectly. It's about teaching others how to carry their own truth and letting them shape it in their own way. That's why I worked with Sarah to create the Morrison Foundation for Women's Financial Independence. We offer workshops, scholarships, and one-on-one coaching. We help women build not only wealth but confidence, clarity, and community. We teach them the skills I once had to learn alone in the dark, and that's also why I chose to rewrite my will again, this time. Not from a place of punishment or control, but from a place of intentional love. I gave generously to those who had grown, who had chosen respect, honesty, and connection, who had chosen me, not just my resources. I also wrote letters to my grandchildren. Each one personal, heartfelt, and focused not on what they'd inherit, but on who they could become. To Emma, I wrote, be curious. Ask your own questions. Don't let the world hand you a version of someone, meet them yourself. That's how you'll find the truth. To Jonah, it's okay to love numbers, but don't forget the people behind them. Empathy will serve you better than any algorithm. To Sophie, you are the beginning of someone else's legacy. Carry that with joy, not pressure. Live your truth out loud. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: I am no longer afraid of it. I don't fear aging. I don't fear being underestimated. I don't even fear being alone, because I know who I am. And that knowledge is my anchor. I've also realized that authenticity isn't just about truth-telling. It's about alignment. About living in a way where your inner self doesn't have to hide from your outer life. That's the real reward, not money, not status, not vindication. Authenticity is the most generous thing we can offer the world. Now, I live differently. I don't rush. I don't apologize for taking up space. I don't edit myself to make others comfortable. I sit in my garden. I answer calls from women across the country. I read investment reports with tea and honey. I laugh with Sarah and Michael. I walk with Madison. I write letters to Sophie, and I rest not out of exhaustion, but from fulfillment. I think often about the phrase Marcus once used when I overheard him. She needs to feel needed.
He wasn't wrong, but he misunderstood. It's not that I needed
to be needed. It's that I needed to be known. And now I am. That is my legacy, not the trust fund, not the buildings or accounts, not the speaking engagements or foundations. My legacy is that I lived fully, that I reclaimed myself, that I told the truth and let it echo, and that I gave others, especially women, especially mothers, especially the unseen, permission to do the same. So if you're listening, if you followed this story and felt the quiet sting of familiarity, this is for you. You are not invisible. You are not irrelevant. You are not past your prime. You are not too late. You are just beginning. Start where you are. Learn what you must. Grow quietly if you must, but don't stay quiet forever. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And the most valuable thing you can share with people isn't your money, it's your truth. Because when you live authentically, you don't just change your own life. You light the path for others. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.